The morning Delia Doyle climbed out of a second-story window with nothing but a carpet bag and a bruise yellowing along her jaw. She told herself she was not afraid, but her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the bag twice before her boots hit the dry Texas dust below. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harlow Creek was just waking up. The blacksmith's hammer had not yet started its morning rhythm. The roosters were still deciding whether the sky was pale enough to justify the noise. Delia moved fast through the alley behind the saloon, past the overturned crates that smelled of sour mash and old leather, and she did not look back at the upstairs window of the room she had shared with Roy Hatch for 2 years that felt more like 20. She had met Roy Hatch when she was 19 and foolish, which is to say she had been exactly the kind of young woman who mistakes a man's certainty for strength. Roy was certain about everything. He was certain the eggs were undercooked when they were not. He was certain the neighbor's dog was looking at him wrong. He was certain, above all else, that Delia belonged to him the way a man owns a rifle, something to be kept oiled and loaded and never pointed at anyone else. She was 22 now, and she was done. She had $43 tucked into the lining of her boot, money she had saved 1 coin at a time over the course of 8 months, slipping pennies and the occasional dime into a small tear she had made in the leather heel. Roy had never noticed because Roy did not think Delia capable of planning. That was his first mistake. His second was falling asleep before midnight on the one night when the stage to Caldwell Wells ran at 4 in the morning. The stage station sat at the edge of town, a squat adobe building with a lean-to roof, and a man named Cutter who dozed in a chair out front with his hat over his face. Delia paid her fare with coins she pulled from her boot right there in the dim lantern light, and Cutter barely looked at her, which suited her perfectly. There were 2 other passengers, a traveling merchant with a round belly and spectacles, and an older woman in black wool who pressed a handkerchief to her nose and said nothing at all. Delia took the far corner seat, pressed her back against the wall of the coach, and watched Harlow Creek disappear behind them as the horses pulled them northwest into the dark. She breathed for what felt like the first time in 2 years. The road to Caldwell Wells took 11 hours over ground that was not kind to wheels or spines, and by the time the stage rolled to a stop in front of the Caldwell Wells depot, Delia's back ached and her jaw had begun to throb again where the bruise lived. She stepped down into the street and stood for a moment just blinking in the afternoon sun, looking at a town she had never seen before, where nobody knew her name and nobody knew Roy Hatch's name, and the air smelled like cedar and dust, and something frying somewhere that made her stomach remind her she had not eaten since yesterday morning. Caldwell Wells was larger than Harlow Creek by some measure. It had a proper main street with a bank, a dry goods store, a land office, a barber, 2 saloons, a modest hotel called the Granville Arms, and at the far end, backed up against a ridge of low red rock, a livery stable with a hand-painted sign that read Walden and Sons Horses, Boarding and Trade. Delia did not notice that sign on her first afternoon. She was focused on more immediate concerns, namely finding somewhere to sleep that was not going to drain her $43 inside a week. She went into the dry goods store first because she needed crackers and because dry goods stores were the clearinghouses of small-town information. The woman behind the counter was somewhere between 40 and 60, with iron-gray hair pinned into a bun so tight it seemed to be holding her expression in place. Passing through or staying, the woman asked, not unkindly. "Staying, I hope," Delia said, "if there's work to be had." The woman, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Effie Crane, looked Delia over with the particular thoroughness of a woman who has seen a great many things and learned to read the evidence of them quickly. Her eyes landed briefly on the jaw. She did not comment on it. "Agatha Petty over at the hotel takes in boarders for $3 a week if you help with breakfast service," Mrs. Crane said, "and Doc Haverson's been needing someone to keep his office in order since his wife passed. He's a decent man before you worry." Delia felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she could express with just 2 words. She ate crackers and dried apricots sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in the room she took at the Granville Arms, and she looked at the ceiling and made herself a list of what she needed and what she intended to do about each item on it. And by the time she fell asleep, she had stopped shaking. She did not think about Roy Hatch. She did not let herself. The first week in Caldwell Wells passed in the focused blur of a woman building something from scratch. She secured the boarding arrangement with Agatha Petty, who was a small, brisk woman who moved as though she were always slightly late for something, and who asked no questions about where Delia had come from, which Delia appreciated enormously. The breakfast service was straightforward biscuits, gravy, coffee, the occasional egg, and Delia was good in a kitchen, having learned to cook well because the alternative in Roy's house had been worse than the effort. She also called on Dr. Haverson, who proved to be exactly what Mrs. Crane had described, a round-shouldered man of about 55 with kind eyes and an office that looked like a paper storm had recently passed through it. He hired her on the spot to organize his files, keep his instruments clean, and receive patients when he was out on calls. The pay was modest but added to what she earned at the hotel. It was enough, just barely, to feel like solid ground. It was in the second week that she began to notice the town more fully, to learn its rhythms and its personalities. Caldwell Wells had about it the particular character of a place that was neither finished nor quite begun, a frontier town in the later stages of becoming something more permanent. The railroad had not come this far yet, though there was talk of it, the kind of talk that excited some people and made others nervous. There were families here, real ones, with children who ran in the streets and a schoolhouse that sat behind the church. There were also drifters, gamblers, men who passed through with their eyes measuring everything for value and their hands never far from the guns on their hips. Delia had learned to read men quickly. It was a skill she had developed the way most women in her position developed it, through necessity rather than choice. She could tell within 30 seconds of an introduction whether a man was the kind who would eventually make her life smaller, and she had become, in the wake of Roy Hatch, somewhat allergic to the entire gender as a consequence. She was therefore not looking for anything when she walked into the livery stable on a Wednesday afternoon in her third week in Caldwell Wells, leading the limping horse she had borrowed from Agatha Petty to run an errand for Dr. Haverson, and found herself face to face with Benjamin Walden. He was working at the near end of the stable when she came in, bent over the rear hoof of a bay mare, a horseshoe nail held between his teeth, and a look of absolute concentration on his face. He was tall, that was the first thing she noticed, not because height was remarkable, but because the way he carried it was, without the posturing that tall men often fell into, as though his size were a fact he had simply made peace with. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and arms that showed the evidence of years of physical work, and when he heard the door and looked up, the nail still between his teeth, his eyes were a shade of brown so dark they were nearly black, and they were calm in a way that Delia did not immediately know what to do with. He took the nail from his teeth and straightened. "Help you," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, not the voice of a man performing anything. "The horse is limping," Delia said. She kept her voice matter of fact. "She borrowed out fine this morning, but she's been favoring the left front for the past mile." He came around the mare he had been working on and walked to Delia's horse, a roan named Biscuit who belonged to Agatha and had strong opinions about everything. He crouched down without asking permission, ran a hand down Biscuit's leg with practiced care, and found the problem, a small stone lodged in the frog of the hoof, in about 45 seconds. He dealt with it quietly, efficiently, without any fanfare, and when he stood back up he was looking at Biscuit rather than at Delia, and he said, "She'll be fine. Stone was fresh, no bruising. Keep her off hard road for today if you can." "Thank you," Delia said. He nodded. Not a short nod, not a dismissive one, just the nod of a man who had done a thing that needed doing and considered the transaction complete. Delia was halfway out the door when he said, not in a way that stopped her but just in a way that was offered, "She does that in rocky ground if she's not shod recently. If she belongs to Mrs. Petty, she's overdue. I can do it this week if she wants to bring her in." "I'll tell her," Delia said. She walked back to Dr. Haverson's office and did not think about Benjamin Walden for the rest of the afternoon. This was a deliberate choice, and like most deliberate choices she made in those early weeks, it required more effort than it should have. Agatha Petty, when informed of the shoeing matter, nodded and said, "Oh, that boy is good with horses. His father was too, God rest him. Benjamin runs that stable on his own now. Has done since he was 20. She said it with the fond practicality of a woman who had watched someone grow up, not with any kind of pointed implication, but Delia noticed the information settling into her anyway. She went back to the livery on Friday with Biscuit, because Agatha had asked her to, and because it was on her way, and for no other reason. Benjamin Walden was in the yard when she arrived, talking to a man in a suit who had the look of someone trying to negotiate and not enjoying the experience. She heard the tail end of it as she came up. "I've told you the same thing twice now," Benjamin was saying, and his voice had not changed its quality. It was still unhurried, still level, but there was something underneath it that was not quite warning and not quite patience, something that lived in the space between the two. "This horse has been ridden too hard and needs 2 weeks of rest and good feed before he goes anywhere. That's not a negotiation. That's what's true." The man in the suit looked deeply displeased, but he left, and Benjamin turned to Delia and Biscuit without any of the previous conversation following him into this one. "Mrs. Petty's mare," he said. "Yes," Delia said. She tied Biscuit to the fence rail while he got his tools, and she sat on the fence because there was no particular reason to stand, and the afternoon sun was warm in a way that felt like a concession the Texas spring had decided to make, and she watched him work. He was neat about it in the way that skilled people are neat, not precious or showy, just economical. He talked to Biscuit while he worked, low words that were not quite sentences, but that the horse clearly understood as reassurance because her ears stopped flicking backward after about 2 minutes. "You talked to them all?" Delia asked. He looked up briefly, then back at the hoof he was fitting. "Seems to help." "Father had a horse," Delia said, which surprised her slightly because she had not intended to say anything personal. "He talked to her too. She was 17 years old when she died, and she never had a bad day in her life." "Good horse," Benjamin said. "Good man," Delia said. There was a pause, and she had the strange sensation of having said something that landed in the air between them with more weight than she had meant it to carry. "You're new to Caldwell Wells," he said. It was not quite a question. 3 weeks, Delia said, "working for Dr. Haverson and Mrs. Petty." "Haverson's a good doctor," Benjamin said. "Mrs. Petty's a good woman." "They are," Delia agreed. He finished the front feet and moved to the back, and the conversation ended there in the comfortable way that conversations can end when neither party feels the need to fill silence. Delia sat on the fence and watched the afternoon light move across the red rock at the end of the street and felt, for the first time since she had left Harlow Creek, something close to ordinary. Not happy yet, not quite, but ordinary, which was its own kind of extraordinary. When he was done and she was untying Biscuit to lead her home, Benjamin Walden said, "She'll need it again in 6 weeks." "I'll bring her," Delia said. She did not say anything else, and neither did he, and she walked back to the Granville Arms in the early evening with the roan clomping beside her, and she thought about the quality of the silence in that stable yard, the way it had not felt like the dangerous kind. She had spent 2 years in a house where silence was a warning, where the absence of noise meant Roy was calculating something, building towards something, and the sound of his footstep on the stair could mean a dozen different things, only one of which was neutral. She had learned to read silences the way sailors read weather, and the silence in the livery yard had been, she searched for the word and landed on it clean. like something that did not need to be anything other than what it was. She told herself this meant nothing. She had been wrong about men before. Over the next several weeks, Delia built her life in Caldwell Wells with the careful attention of someone who understands that stability is constructed rather than given. She was efficient in the mornings at the hotel, quick and reliable enough that Agatha Petty began to leave her more of the running of breakfast on her own. In the afternoons, she was at Dr. Haverson's office, which she had organized within the first week into something that actually functioned, and Haverson had looked at the newly filed records one morning with an expression of genuine gratitude and said, "I forgot I had half of these. I owe you a raise." She was making friends in the way of a careful woman, which is to say slowly and deliberately. Mrs. Crane at the dry goods store had taken a liking to her. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Frances Oakes, had introduced herself at church and was the kind of bright, direct person who was easy to be around. The marshal's wife, a heavy-set woman named Clara Briggs who made exceptional pie and had a laugh that could be heard from 2 buildings away, had taken it upon herself to include Delia in a Thursday afternoon quilting circle that Delia attended not for the quilting but for the company. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape. And all the while, in the way that things happen when you are not particularly inviting them, she kept encountering Benjamin Walden. He was simply present in the fabric of the town in the way that people who do necessary work are present. She saw him at the feed store. She saw him leading a string of horses down the main street one morning when a rancher had brought in a new group for boarding. She saw him at the church on Sunday mornings, standing at the back with his hat in his hands and his dark eyes serious, though she was never certain whether he was actually listening to the sermon or simply present for the social fabric of it. Once she saw him help an elderly man whose wagon wheel had come loose outside the land office, stopping on his way to wherever he had been going and fixing the thing with quiet competence before the man had fully registered what was happening. She noticed all of these things. She told herself she was just observant by nature. The Thursday that changed the texture of things began ordinarily enough. She was walking back from the quilting circle in the late afternoon when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the feed store and recognized, with a cold jolt that had nothing to do with the temperature, the particular cadence of a man who had been drinking and had found a target. She stopped. Her first instinct, and it was Roy Hatch's legacy, this instinct was to keep walking, to make herself small and uninvolved, because involvement invited attention and attention from men in that state invited things you could not predict. But the voice in the alley was followed by a smaller sound, a child's sound, frightened, and that changed the calculation entirely. She went around the corner and found a man she did not recognize, broad-shouldered, red-faced with drink, wearing a rancher's clothes that had seen better days, standing over a boy of about 12 who had, from the scattered look of things, knocked over a crate of some kind while running past. The man had the boy by the collar and was saying things that were not worth repeating, and the boy was white-faced and rigid with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is sometimes the safest option. "Let him go," Delia said. Her own voice surprised her. It was steady. She was not, but her voice was, and she had learned long ago that the voice was the thing that mattered first. The man looked at her with the offended confusion of someone whose scene has been interrupted. "Mind your business," he said. "I am minding it," Delia said. "The boy knocked over a crate by accident. Let him go and we'll all be on our way." The man took a step toward her instead, which was what drunk men with inflated grievances often did, and she stood her ground because backing away only works if you are going somewhere, and there was a wall behind her. She did not hear Benjamin Walden come into the alley. She did not see him arrive. He was simply there, stepping from the feed store side door with a calmness that was almost startling in its completeness, standing between Delia and the man with the kind of quiet that takes up a great deal of physical space. "Decker," he said. Just the name. Nothing added to it. The man Decker stopped. He blinked at Benjamin with the complicated calculation of a drunk man deciding whether the target has changed. Benjamin did not reach for anything, did not put a hand near the gun he wore, did not raise his voice. He stood there in the alley with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes steady, and the man read something in that stillness, and decided, after a long moment, that he did not want the particular version of trouble that was being offered. He released the boy's collar, muttered something obscene, and walked away down the alley with the aggressive dignity of a man pretending the decision had been entirely his own. The boy bolted. Benjamin watched Decker go until he had rounded the corner, and then he looked at Delia. She was aware that she was still standing straight, still holding the posture she had taken when she had entered the alley, and that her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, had curled into fists she had not noticed making. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. Then, because it was true, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his expression something that was not pity. She had become expert at identifying pity, which she found useless and patronizing, but something more like acknowledgement, as though he had seen the situation clearly and registered that she had handled the beginning of it herself. "Decker's harmless most of the time," he said. "But most of the time isn't always." "I know that," Delia said. Something passed across his face briefly at the way she said it. He didn't ask. They walked out of the alley side by side onto the main street, which felt unexpectedly natural, and parted where their directions separated, and Delia carried the afternoon home with her and placed it carefully into the collection of small, significant things she was not yet ready to examine. She did examine it that night, in the dark of her room with the window open, and the night sounds of Caldwell Wells coming through horses, distant laughter, the wind off the ridge. And she thought about the fact that what had unsettled her was not the drunk man, not truly, or not only. It was the way Benjamin Walden had come to stand beside her rather than in front of her. The way he had addressed the situation without removing her from it, without acting as though her presence in that alley had been a problem to be managed rather than a choice to be respected. Roy Hatch would have been furious. Roy would have seen her walking into that alley as a defiance, a display of independence that required correction. Roy would have made the entire incident about his authority and her lack of judgment, and none of it would have had anything to do with the boy or the situation. Benjamin Walden had simply come and stood beside her, and when it was over, he had asked if she was all right. She was not sure she had a category for this. She was not sure she trusted the category she was beginning to build. She fell asleep thinking about dark, steady eyes, and she woke up the next morning and made 47 biscuits and pretended she had not. The spring deepened into early summer, and the days grew long and golden and full of the particular beauty of the Texas hill country in the hours before the heat became serious. Delia had by now settled into Caldwell Wells in a way that felt less like landing and more like rooting, which was something she had not expected to happen so quickly, but which she recognized and did not resist. This was her place. She was making it so. She and Benjamin Walden did not have what anyone would call a courtship, not at first, and not in any formal sense. What they had was a series of encounters that accumulated like water in a barrel, each one separate and unremarkable, and each one adding to something that was gradually becoming undeniable. He came into Haverson's office one afternoon with a cut on his forearm from a piece of fence wire, and she cleaned it and bandaged it because Haverson was out on a house call, and they talked for the 20 minutes it took about nothing in particular: the coming summer heat, the quality of the hay that had arrived from the valley that week, whether the new family that had taken the old Merriweather farm would stay past the first winter. She noticed that he held still for the cleaning without making a production of either the pain or the stoicism, which was a thing she appreciated, because she had seen both extremes and neither of them was honest. He brought Agatha Petty's horse back one afternoon after Agatha had sent it for something or other, and Delia happened to be in the yard, and they stood together for a while in the comfortable afternoon way, and she learned that his mother had died when he was 14 and his father when he was 20, which was how he had come to run the stable alone, and that he had two brothers who had both gone north to Kansas and whom he heard from occasionally. She offered in return that her parents had both died of fever when she was 16 and that she had lived with an aunt in Harlow Creek until, and she stopped there, but he did not push on it, and she was grateful. He was not a man who pushed. This was a revelation. She was continuously surprised by it because she kept expecting it, kept waiting for the moment when the pushing would start, the version of the conversation where what she said became less important than what he wanted to hear, the shift from one kind of interest to another. It did not come. He listened to her the way she would have liked to be listened to, not with the performance of attention but with the real thing, the version where he actually heard and remembered what she said. She told Francis Oakes about him one afternoon, obliquely, in the way of someone who is not ready to say a thing directly, but needs to say it to someone. Francis was 23, practical and perceptive, and she listened to Delia's careful, circling description and said with characteristic directness, "It sounds like you are very fond of Benjamin Walden." "I don't know him well enough to be fond of him," Delia said. "You've been talking about him for 15 minutes, Francis pointed out. Delia looked at her. "I'm not saying anything bad," Francis said. "He is a good man. Everyone in Caldwell Wells would tell you the same. I'm just saying that knowing something well enough and knowing it are sometimes different things." Delia did not have an answer for that. She thought about it on the walk home, and she thought about it more in the evenings when the hotel was quiet, and the ridge turned red in the last of the light, and she sat on the small porch Agatha had let her use, which faced west and caught the sunset perfectly. She was aware that something had been shifting in her, slowly, since she had arrived in Caldwell Wells, and that the shift was not just about safety and stability and the quiet satisfaction of a life built on her own terms, though it was about those things too. It was also about the growing, frightening recognition that she might be capable of wanting something she had told herself she was done wanting. The question was whether wanting it was wisdom or repetition. She had run from Roy Hatch. She had run in a straight line and she had landed in Caldwell Wells, and she had landed, somehow, in proximity to a man who made her feel things she had been certain she had closed the door on. She was too honest with herself not to see the pattern, the shape of it, the way a woman in flight sometimes runs straight from one situation into the orbit of another. She had done that once. She had been wrong once. The difference, she told herself on one of those evenings, was that she was not the same woman she had been at 19. She had earned something in those 2 years, not just the bruises and the hair-trigger vigilance, but a clarity about what she was worth and what she would and would not accept. She was not running toward Benjamin Walden. She was choosing, deliberately, to stand still long enough to see what was actually there. It was a hot July evening, the kind where the air has not forgiven the day and the sunset looks like the sky is working through something, when she finally said something honest. She had been at the livery, again, this time to check on a horse that Dr. Haverson had borrowed for a distant house call and which had come back with a sore from an ill-fitting saddle. Benjamin was in the stable doing the evening feeding which he always did himself. He had a boy who helped in the daytime, but the evenings were his, and she sat on a hay bale in the lantern light while he went down the row of stalls, and at some point between the 4th and 5th stall the quiet between them shifted from ordinary to something else. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He paused, looked at her over the gate of the stall. "Go ahead." "Why haven't you asked," she said, "where I came from? Why I'm here? The things that are obvious." She touched briefly the side of her jaw, though the bruise had long since faded, but the reference was clear. He considered this for a moment with the seriousness that she had come to recognize as his natural mode for anything that mattered. "It's your story," he said. "You'll tell it or you won't, and either way it doesn't change what's in front of me." She looked at him for a long moment across the wooden gate and the warm lantern light and the smell of hay and horses. "What is in front of you?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than she had intended. He held her gaze. Someone worth knowing, he said. Simply, without decoration. Delia looked down at her hands in her lap and breathed, and the thing she was feeling was so large and unexpected and terrifying that she had to sit with it for a moment before she could do anything about it. I came from a man who was not kind, she said. She had not planned to say it, and now that she had started she found she could not stop, not completely. 2 years with someone who, I was not what he wanted me to be. I was not enough of some things and too much of others, depending on the day. I left in the spring and I walked out a window and I came here and I have been trying to build something that belongs to me. You have, Benjamin said. He was not moving, not coming closer, not doing anything but standing there with his hand resting on the gate post and his eyes on her face. I've watched you do it for months. I am not, she stopped, tried again. I am not someone who makes the same mistake twice. I need you to know that. I do know that, he said. And I am not easy, she said, and there was something fierce in it now. I have opinions and I have things I will not put up with. Not anymore. Good, he said. The word was so simply meant, so cleanly delivered, that something in her chest cracked open in a way that was not painful exactly, but was the feeling that comes when something that has been held very tight for a very long time is finally allowed to be less held. You are very strange, she said, and she meant it as the highest possible compliment. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. You're the second person to say that to me this week. Who was the first? My mare, she's very expressive, Delia laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it came out surprised and real, and she put a hand over her mouth for a moment, and then took it away because there was no reason to hide it. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just seen something precious and knows it. After that evening, things changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of declarations and gestures, but in the quiet way of two people who have agreed on something without needing to say it in so many words. He began to call at the hotel on Sunday afternoons, when neither of them had other obligations, and they walked. It became a thing, the Sunday walk, down the main street and out along the creek bed, and sometimes up the ridge if the afternoon was cool enough, talking about everything and nothing. The town and the weather and the books Delia had borrowed from the lending collection at the church, and the horses Benjamin was working with, and the state of the territory, and the question of whether the railroad was coming and what it would mean if it did. She was happy on those walks. She recognized the sensation with a slight wariness, the way you treat something delicate because you know what it means if you break it. But the wariness began to loosen as the weeks passed, and Benjamin was consistently, reliably himself, thoughtful and quiet and funny in the dry, understated way of someone whose humor comes from observation rather than performance, and steady in the way that she had begun to understand, was not a suppression of emotion but an actual nature, a man who had simply made peace with himself and the world in a way that allowed him to move through both without drama. She told him everything, eventually. Over several Sundays, piece by piece, the way you dismantle a wall that has been load-bearing carefully, taking out one stone at a time and checking that the structure can bear the change. She told him about Roy Hatch, all of it, the careful patience at the beginning and the way it had curdled, the rules that multiplied, the silences that meant danger, the nights when she had lain awake calculating the distance to the door. She told him about the window and the $43 in her boot and the stage at 4 in the morning. He listened to all of it. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment, and she could see that he was managing something. Not grief exactly, but the kind of controlled anger that a man feels when someone has been treated badly, and there is nothing useful he can do about the person responsible. He did not say anything about Roy that was performative. He did not say what he would do if he ever met him. He just said, "I am glad you got out," and the simplicity of it was more comfort than any elaborate response would have been. "I am glad I got out too," she said. They were sitting on the ridge that afternoon, looking down at the town in the long light, and she was aware that his shoulder was close to hers, and that she did not want to move away from it, and she did not. He reached over and took her hand. He held it with the quiet certainty of someone who knows what they want, and has decided that the moment has come to say so in the oldest, simplest language available. Delia looked down at their hands and then up at his face. "I have been thinking," he said, "for some time that I would like to ask you something." "Then ask," she said. "I would like to keep Sundays with you," he said, "and Mondays and Tuesdays and the rest of them too, if you're agreeable. I would like to do that properly." She smiled, slow and warm, the kind of smile that does not show up for anything that is not entirely genuine. "That is not much of a question," she said. "There is no question in there." "You're right," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted. "I am asking whether you would consent to my company, Miss Doyle, more regularly than Sundays. With the intention of more than walks eventually, if that is something you want." "I want walks for now," she said honestly, "and we will see about the rest." "That's all I'm asking," he said. She squeezed his hand once and did not let go of it, and they sat on the ridge in the August evening and watched the town below them going about its life, and Delia felt something settle in her that she did not have a word for, only the sensation of it, deep and quiet like bedrock. August turned to September and the light changed its quality, going from white to gold, and the mornings cooled first and the evenings followed, and the cottonwood trees along the creek went yellow, and then amber and the ridge turned a deeper shade of red. Delia noticed all of it. She had spent 2 years in a state of inward vigilance so constant that there had been no attention left for the external world, and now she was attending to things again, the world and the light and the quality of the air, and Benjamin Walden, who walked through all of it with her. They were not without their difficulties. She had moments of pulling back, of going quiet and closed in the way of someone who has been burned and cannot always tell the stove from the sunlight. He noticed when this happened, and he did not press, did not demand explanation, did not take it as a referendum on himself, which was the response she had feared and had known would be the test. He simply gave her the room to be what she was in the moment, and waited, and when she came back she always found him where she had left him. Once in early October she snapped at him over something so trivial she was embarrassed by it even as she was doing it, something about a horse he had lent to someone she thought was careless, and the argument beneath the argument was not about the horse at all, and they both knew it. He let her finish. Then he said quietly, "I hear what you're actually saying, and I am not Roy Hatch." It stopped her cold. She looked at him, and the truth of what he had said was plain and clean and without accusation. "I know," she said. "I know you are not. I am sorry." "You don't need to apologize for being afraid," he said. "You just need to tell me when it's happening if you can. So I know what I'm working with." "What you're working with," she repeated, and despite herself she almost smiled. "I chose my words poorly," he admitted, and now she did smile fully and the tightness of the afternoon dissolved. "I will try," she said, "to tell you, when it is the fear talking instead of me." "That's all I need," he said. They were not, either of them, people who used large words carelessly, and so when they used them they meant something. The first time he told her he loved her was in November, on a Sunday, standing in the doorway of the livery in a cold rain with a cup of coffee he had made on the small stove he kept in the tack room, pressing it into her hands because she had come by on an errand and gotten caught in the weather. He said it the way you say a thing you have known for a while, and decided it was time to say directly, without preamble, while she was warming her hands on the coffee cup and had not been expecting it. She stood very still. "I have been meaning to say it for a while," he said. "I did not want to say it before you were ready to hear it." "How did you know when I was ready?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. "I just decided the rain seemed like a good time." She looked at him over the rim of the cup, at his rain-wet hair and his steady dark eyes and his absolute unhurried certainty, and she said, "I love you too, Benjamin," and meant every single letter of it. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something open and tender and entirely unguarded. And then he took the cup from her hands and set it on the bench and kissed her, slow and warm and deliberate, in the doorway of the livery, with the November rain coming down outside. And she kissed him back with her hands against his chest, and her heart doing something complicated and good. They told people in the way that things like this are told in small towns, which is to say they told no one officially and everyone knew within a week. Mrs. Crane at the dry goods store smiled at Delia the following Monday with a satisfaction that suggested personal credit was being silently claimed. Clara Briggs announced at the Thursday quilting circle that she had known since August and had simply been waiting for the two of them to catch up to the rest of the town. Frances Oakes hugged Delia and said, "I told you so," with tremendous warmth, and Delia laughed and said she supposed she had. Agatha Petty said nothing, which was her highest form of approval. December came with cold nights and frost on the water barrel each morning, and the town put up the kind of modest decorations that frontier towns put up at Christmas, greenery cut from the cedar trees on the ridge, candles in windows, the church strung with red ribbon. There was a dance at the community hall on the Friday before Christmas, and Delia wore her best dress, which was blue and had been bought from Mrs. Crane's dry goods store for exactly this kind of occasion, and Benjamin came to collect her from the hotel in a clean coat and a freshly barbered look that she found so endearing she had to breathe carefully. He was not a natural dancer. He was honest about this at the outset, warning her that his footwork should not be held against his general competence as a person, and she laughed and said she was not much of a dancer either, and between the two of them they managed something that was enthusiastic if not technically accomplished, and she did not care at all. What she cared about was his hand at her waist and his voice near her ear telling her something about the man across the hall who had once fallen into a horse trough trying to mount too quickly. A story he told with quiet humor and impeccable timing, and the way the room moved around them warm and bright and full of the ordinary Christmas music of a frontier town that was, improbably, one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard. She thought that night that she had not known this was possible. Not this specific version of it, this ease and warmth, and the feeling of being seen and valued and delighted in rather than owned. She had not known because she had never seen it modeled and had never been given it and had not known how to want something whose shape she did not know. She had run from Roy Hatch and had run straight into the territory of a man who was nothing like him, nothing at all, and the irony of the direction was not lost on her, but it was also not, in the end, irony. It was just the way some stories go. You run in a straight line and you hit something unexpected, and if you are lucky, if you are paying attention, it turns out to be exactly what you needed. She had been paying attention. They were engaged by February. He asked her properly on a Sunday, as one does, standing in the livery yard with the horses watching and the sky very blue overhead, and he did not make a large production of it, but he was serious and clear. And he told her that she was the best person he knew and that he would like to spend his life alongside her, not in front of her and not behind her, alongside her, and would she be willing? She said yes before he had finished the sentence. Mrs. Crane cried a small amount. Clara Briggs brought pie. Frances Oakes was named as Delia's maid of honor within the same conversation, and accepted the position with a gravity that was immediately undermined by the size of her smile. Doctor. Haverson shook Benjamin's hand and said, "She is an exceptional person," in the tone of a man ensuring that the other man understood the gravity of what he was taking on, and Benjamin said, "I know it, sir," in a tone that indicated he did. They were married on the 15th of April, 1879, which was exactly 1 year to the month from the morning Delia Doyle had climbed out of a second-story window with $43 in her boot and a yellowing bruise on her jaw. The ceremony was at the church, conducted by Reverend Ellis, who was a small man with a large voice and a genuine fondness for wedding ceremonies, and the whole of Caldwell Wells seemed to be in attendance, or at least as much of it as could fit in the pews plus 3 rows of chairs brought in from the community hall. It was a warm April morning, all sky and birdsong, and Delia walked down the aisle on Dr. Haverson's arm because he was the closest thing to a father she had in this place, and he had offered and she had accepted. And when she reached the front of the church and looked at Benjamin Walden standing there in his best coat with his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression that she knew she would spend the rest of her life trying to do justice to in memory, she felt once, very profoundly, the truth that she had built something good, not been given something, not stumbled into something. Built it with her own hands and her own choices, and her own hard-won knowledge of what she would and would not accept. The Reverend spoke the words and they spoke them back. And when Benjamin said, "I do," it was in the same voice he used for everything that mattered. The quiet, certain, unhurried voice of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. And when Delia said, "I do," it was in a voice that was steady and clear and entirely her own. They were husband and wife, and the church applauded with the enthusiasm of a town that had been invested in this outcome for some time. The reception was at the community hall, with dancing and Mrs. Crane's tablecloths and a cake that Clara Briggs and 2 other women had made as their contribution, and which was spectacular. And there was music from a fiddle player named Henderson, who could keep a reel going for 40 minutes without flagging. Benjamin danced with her again, better this time because he had been practicing, he admitted later, which was the kind of thing that made her love him more rather than less. He had asked Henderson to teach him 3 dances over the course of the winter, quietly in the evenings, without telling Delia, because he wanted to be better at it for her. This was Benjamin Walden. This was the kind of man he was. They moved into the house attached to the livery, which had been his father's house, and which Benjamin had kept in a state of tidy minimalism that Delia began immediately and happily to change. She brought her small collection of things from the hotel room: the books, the blue curtain fabric she had bought from Mrs. Crane 2 months ago with this in mind, the pressed flower from a walk on the ridge that she kept between 2 pieces of paper, and she arranged them in the rooms of the house with the quiet satisfaction of a person claiming territory that belongs to them. She also went back to work at both the hotel and Haverson's office, because she was not the kind of woman who stopped working when she married, and because Benjamin had never in any conversation implied that she should be, and because the work was hers and she liked it and it was part of who she was. Benjamin closed the stable every evening and came home and cooked dinner on the nights she was late, which he did with the same methodical competence he brought to horseshoeing and fence repair, and everything else he put his hands to. And she ate it and told him what she had found that was interesting about the day, and he told her the same, and it was so simple and so good. The spring and summer of that first year of marriage were full of the small pleasures and occasional adjustments of 2 people building a shared life. They learned each other's rhythms. She learned that he was a morning person in the deepest possible sense, awake and alert before the sun, and at his best in the first hours, and he learned that she needed coffee before she was capable of full sentences, and that this was a condition rather than a preference. She learned that he had strong opinions about the care of tools and the organization of the stable, and that these opinions, while specific, were not transferable to the rest of the house, and he was genuinely indifferent to whether the dishes went on the left shelf or the right. He learned that she had a habit of reading until far later than was wise, and that this was non-negotiable and should be accommodated. They laughed a great deal. She had not expected this, exactly happiness she had begun to expect, or at least to hope for, but the specific quality of laughter that they had together, which came easily and often, and was frequently his dry understatement meeting her quick wit at exactly the right angle. This was a surprise and a continuous delight. In the fall of 1879, she realized she was carrying their first child, and she told Benjamin on a Sunday evening sitting on the porch in the cool dusk, saying it plainly, the way she had learned to say things she meant with her whole self. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something moved him more than he had room for in a single breath, and then he took her hand and held it and looked out at the ridge and said, quietly, "That is the best thing you have ever told me." "I've told you some good things," she pointed out. "The best," he repeated. The town was delighted. Clara Briggs brought pie of a different kind. One she declared was specifically for expecting mothers, and whether this was a real thing or a Clara Briggs invention, no one was quite sure, but the pie was excellent regardless. Mrs. Crane knit something small and yellow. Frances Oakes announced her own engagement to the new schoolmaster who had come in September, and so the spring of 1880 promised weddings and births in approximately equal measure, which pleased everyone. The winter was cold and quiet and good in the way of winters that are cold and quiet and good, when you have wood on the fire and someone beside you who is happy to be there. Delia read and Benjamin mended things that needed mending, and they talked about the baby and what they would name it, and what their lives would look like in 5 years and 10 years and 50. And the conversations were the best kind, full of both the practical and the dreamed. The child was born in March of 1880, a boy, arriving on a cold morning with Dr. Haverson in attendance and Benjamin in the next room being managed by Clara Briggs, who had positioned herself as the authority on this process and was not accepting argument. He was a strong boy, healthy and loud, with his father's dark eyes already hinted at in the deep blue that newborn eyes sometimes showed. And when Delia held him for the first time, she felt something that she recognized as belonging to a category she had not had access to before, a love that was physical and total and entirely unlike anything she had known. They named him Samuel James Walden, for Benjamin's father and Delia's grandfather, 2 men who had been worth naming a child after. Benjamin held his son with the careful reverence of a man who is large-handed and aware of his own size and compensating accordingly, and looked at him with an expression so nakedly tender that Delia, who had seen many of his expressions and knew them all, found this one entirely new and fell in love with him a second time over the sight of it. "You're holding him like he might break," she said. "He might," Benjamin said. "He won't," she said. "They're stronger than they look." Benjamin looked down at Samuel, and something in his face shifted into a kind of settled certainty. "He is," he agreed. "He's very strong." Caldwell Wells received young Samuel Walden with the collective warmth of a town that considers itself invested in its families, which is to say, everyone had an opinion and a gift and a piece of advice, and the Walden house in April was frequently full of visitors and casseroles and small knitted items, and Delia accepted all of it with genuine gratitude and navigated the crowd with the efficient grace of a woman who is very tired and very happy and knows the difference between the two. The years that followed built themselves in the way that good years build, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary friction of life, but with a solid accumulating warmth that was the evidence of something true. Caldwell Wells changed around them, as frontier towns did. The railroad arrived in 1882, 2 years later than anyone had predicted and sooner than others had feared, and with it came more people and a different pace, more commerce, new buildings, the particular energy of expansion. Benjamin expanded the livery to accommodate the increased traffic, taking on 2 permanent hands and building a new barn at the back of the property. Delia left the hotel service. Agatha Petty had semi-retired by then, and her niece had taken over, and went to work full-time for Dr. Haverson, who had begun to rely on her so completely that she had effectively become his partner in the practice, doing more than organizing and receiving, learning the medicines and the procedures by proximity and question, developing a genuine skill with patients that Haverson recognized and valued openly. "If you had been a man," Haverson told her once, "you would have been a doctor." "I know," she said, without resentment, because in 1882 this was simply a fact of the world, not one she was at peace with exactly, but one she had learned to work around with the practical ingenuity of a woman who understands that the limitation is the world's problem rather than hers. In the summer of 1883, their second child was born, a girl this time, who came into the world with a fierce expression and an immediate displeasure with her surroundings that suggested she had opinions and intended to express them. They named her Eleanor Ruth, for Delia's mother and Benjamin's grandmother, and Eleanor Ruth Walden lived up to her expression, being a child of great determination and considerable volume who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and was adored by everyone including the horses, which she had at the age of 2 somehow already charmed. Samuel at 3 had become a solid, serious child with his father's habit of watchful quiet and his mother's capacity for sudden and complete delight, and the two children together made the house noisier and fuller and more alive than anything Delia could have pictured from the second-story window she had climbed through 5 years earlier. She thought about that morning sometimes, not with pain anymore, but with the quiet attention you give to a thing that has become part of the geography of your life. The woman who had climbed out of that window, shaking, with $43 and a bruised jaw, had been her. Was still her, in all the ways that matter: the same stubborn clarity, the same quick mind, the same capacity for love that had been turned toward wrong things and had survived the turning and found its proper direction. She carried that woman with her, not as a wound but as a foundation. She had run from one kind of man. She had run straight into Benjamin Walden, who was the kind she had not known existed, not because men like him were impossible, but because she had never been shown one, never been close enough to one to know the shape of it, to know what it felt like to be with someone whose power over your life was entirely in the service of making it better, and never in the service of making himself larger. She understood now what her father must have been, in the oblique and incomplete way you understand things about people from the effects they leave. Her father had talked to his horse in the quiet of the stable. He had been a man worth naming a child after. She had always known this in the abstract, and now she knew it in the particular, in the daily lived experience of what it looked like. In the spring of 1884, Roy Hatch came to Caldwell Wells. She did not know he was there until Mrs. Crane came into Haverson's office at 2 in the afternoon and told her, with the careful precision of a woman delivering information she knows requires handling, that a man matching the description Delia had once, a long time ago, given her had come into the dry goods store asking about a woman named Delia Doyle. Delia set down the instrument she was cleaning and stood very still for a moment. "Did he say where he was going?" she asked. "I told him I'd never heard the name," Mrs. Crane said, "and then I came straight here." Delia looked at her with a gratitude she could not measure in words. "Thank you, Effie." She went to the livery. Benjamin was in the yard with one of his hands looking at the wheel of a wagon that had come in that morning, and when he saw her face he said something to the hand and came to her immediately. She told him. He listened. He did not say that he would handle it. He did not say to let him take care of things in a way that removed her from the situation. He said, "What do you want to do?" This was the question she had needed someone to ask her, and she had known in the back of her mind that he was the person who would ask it. "I want to go to Marshall Briggs," she said. "I have nothing to hide and nothing to be afraid of, and I will not hide in my own town." "Then let's go," he said. They went to Marshall Briggs together, and Delia told him plainly who Roy Hatch was and what he was likely there for. And the marshal, a man of serious temperament and considerable efficiency, who also happened to have a wife who made exceptional pie and a deep respect for Delia Doyle Walden as a member of his community, listened, and then said, "I'll find him and have a word." Roy Hatch, when found at one of the saloons later that afternoon, turned out to be a man who was, in the cold light of a different life, somewhat less than the monster he had been in the dark of a house she had been afraid to leave. He was thick-necked and red-faced, and had the look of a man who was already not entirely sober at 4 in the afternoon. When the marshal found him and suggested, very clearly, that there was a Mrs. Walden living in Caldwell Wells who had no business with him, and that it would be in his best interest to be gone by morning, Roy Hatch looked at the marshal's badge, and then at Benjamin Walden, who was standing behind the marshal with the particular stillness that Delia had once described to herself as taking up a great deal of physical space. And Roy Hatch decided, for what might have been the only sensible decision of his adult life. That morning was soon enough to leave. He was gone by morning. He never came back. Delia learned of this from Marshal Briggs at the hotel the next day, and she felt, when she was told, something that was not triumph exactly and not relief exactly, but something that lived between the two, a quiet closing of a door that she had always known she had not properly shut. It was shut now. She was grateful, in the way of someone who has been vigilant for a long time and can now lay the vigilance down. She told Benjamin that night after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the late spring night warm through the open window. "It is done," she said. "It is," he said. "I need you to know," she said, "that I was never frightened today. Not the way I used to be frightened." He looked at her. "I was angry," she said, "that he thought he could come here, into my town after my name, but I was not the woman in that window, Benjamin. I have not been her for a long time." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud," she said, "so you know I know it." He reached across the table and took her hand, turned it over in both of his, looked at it with the expression she had learned meant he was holding something large that he was figuring out how to say. "You have always been the most capable person in every room you walk into," he said. "From the first day I saw you walk into this stable with that limping roan, knowing exactly what needed doing and saying it straight. I was in love with you before I had the sense to know what to call it." Delia looked at him across the lamplight and felt the truth of her life surround her so completely. It was almost physical, the warmth of the house and the sleeping children in the back room, and the smell of cedar through the window, and this man across the table from her, with his large, careful hands holding hers and his dark eyes on her face. "I have been building something," she said. "I have been building something since the moment I got off that stage. And it is this, all of this." "It is," he said. She leaned across the table and kissed him, and he met her halfway, and outside the window the night was soft and full of stars, and the sounds of a town they both belonged to. The years continued to pass with the richness of years that are lived fully. Samuel started school in the fall of 1885, and proved to be, as his teacher reported with some amusement, exactly as stubborn as his mother and exactly as patient as his father. And the combination was either going to make him exceptional or make her job very difficult, possibly both simultaneously. Alina Ruth, at 2, had already figured out how to get past the fence gate at the livery, and had been found on 3 separate occasions sitting in the stall with one of the gentler mares in a state of perfect mutual contentment, which Benjamin said was a sign of good judgment, and Delia said was a sign of a child who needed a higher fence. The livery expanded again in 1886, this time with a separate training paddock that Benjamin had been planning for 2 years, and he began to take on horses that needed rehabilitation, animals that had been mishandled or injured, and needed patient work to become useful again. It was work that suited him perfectly, and he was very good at it, and the reputation of the Walden stable grew beyond Caldwell Wells to the broader region. Men came from other counties to bring him difficult horses, and he worked with each one in the same methodical, unhurried way, and the horses became what they should have been all along. Delia thought sometimes that this was what he had done with her, though she would never have said it quite that way. Not that she had been broken, she had not been, not entirely. But she had come to him with damage, with walls built in places walls should not be, with reflexes that were responses to a different situation, and he had worked with her the way he worked with his horses, without forcing, without demanding, giving her the space and the time and the consistent presence that allowed her to figure out that she was safe. The result was not a trained animal. The result was herself, the version of herself she had always been underneath the damage, let out and given room. Dr. Haverson retired in the summer of 1887 and left his practice to Delia in as formal a way as circumstances would allow, which was to say he sold it to her for a price she could manage with the savings she had built over 9 years, and the small loan Benjamin offered immediately and without qualification. It was, he said when she hesitated about the loan, a business arrangement between partners, which was what they were. She accepted it on those terms and understood that he meant it on those terms, and opened the practice in September of 1887 as Delia Walden, physician's practitioner, which was not the title she might have had in a different world, but which was, in this one, the thing she was, and the thing she intended to continue being. Haverson himself, retired to the small house he had kept on the edge of town, continued to come by on Tuesday afternoons under the guise of not being able to break old habits, and they had a standing arrangement that suited both of them perfectly. In the spring of 1888, they welcomed their third child. A boy, born on an April morning that had the same quality of light as the April morning they had married, all sky and birdsong, and the smell of the ridge coming through the window. They named him Thomas Henry, for no one in particular but for the sound of it and the weight of it, and he was a round and amiable baby with Delia's copper-brown hair and his father's steady disposition, and the immediate and comprehensive adoration of a 5-year-old brother and a 4-year-old sister who had already decided collectively that he was the most important new development in their lives and took turns being directly underfoot about it. The house was full. The livery was thriving. The practice was hers. Benjamin and she sat together in the evenings after the children were in bed and the lamps were low and the town settled into its nighttime rhythms. And they were, in the way of people who have worked for something and found it, content. Not the contentment of people who have given up wanting, but the contentment of people who have found that what they wanted was what they have, and who know the difference between that and settling. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, April 15th, 1889, Benjamin surprised her. She had not expected anything elaborate because elaborate was not his way, and she had planned a quiet dinner at home with the children, which was the thing she had said she wanted, which was the truth. But when she came home from the practice at the end of the afternoon, the children were at Clara Briggs's house. Clara having accepted this commission with enthusiasm, and Benjamin had made dinner himself. The good kind. The kind that required multiple pots and a fair amount of concentration. And the table was set with the good cloth and 2 candles, and there were wildflowers in the blue pitcher she had bought from a traveling seller 2 years ago and never known quite what to do with. She stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at it. "You cut wildflowers," she said. "I did," he said. He was leaning against the doorframe to the kitchen, looking at her with his dark eyes warm. "I didn't know you knew where the wildflowers were. I've been planning this since January," he said. "I've been checking them weekly." She sat down at the table because her legs wanted to, and he sat across from her, and the candles made the room golden, and she said, 10 years. 10 years, he said. "When I left Harlow Creek," she said slowly, "I thought I was running. I was running as hard as I could. I did not think I was running toward anything." "You weren't," he said. "You were running toward yourself. I just had the good luck to be in the vicinity." She reached across the table and he met her hand the way he always met her hand, certain and unhurried. "I am glad you were in the vicinity," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." They ate the dinner he had made, which was very good and only slightly overcooked in one place, and they talked about the 10 years and the children and the town and the horses and the practice, and the things that had changed, and the things that had not, and the candles burned down, and the night outside the window was warm and full of the soft sounds of a town that had become, completely and without qualification, home. Francis Drummond now, for 6 years, had told her once, shortly after Delia had confided her growing feelings for Benjamin, that knowing something well enough and knowing it were sometimes different things. Delia had thought about this often over the years in different contexts. It was true of love, she had found, in ways that were not comforting at first and were deeply comforting later. You could know you loved someone in the early way, the bright, anxious new way, and then you could know it in the way of a year, and the way of 5 years, and the way of 10, and each knowing was deeper and more textured and more true than the last, not because the earlier versions were false, but because love was not a thing you arrived at but a thing you kept moving through, discovering new rooms in it, finding things in the dark that the light had not yet reached. She knew Benjamin Walden now in the way of 10 years of shared mornings, and the smell of horses and coffee, and the sound of his voice reading to children, and the particular way he held a hammer, and the way he looked at her when she said something that surprised him, and the quality of his hands when he was worried, and his laugh, which was low and real and rare enough that when it came it was always a gift. She knew him. He knew her, all of her, the whole history, the window and the boot and the $43 and Roy Hatch and the bruise, and the girl she had been before any of it and the woman she was now. He held all of it with equal care. Later, after the dinner and the candles and the wine that Mrs. Crane had obtained for them from a source she declined to specify, they sat on the porch in the warm night, her leaning into his shoulder and his arm around her, and the stars overhead were the same stars she had watched from her room at the Granville Arms in the first weeks after she came to Caldwell Wells, the same stars and a completely different life. "What do you want?" he said, "for the next 10 years?" She considered this seriously, because it was a serious question and deserved a serious answer. "More of this," she said. "This and the children growing and the practice and the horses and Sunday walks when we can still manage them. I want to lean her to ride by the time she is 5. I think she will insist on it regardless. I want Thomas to have more brothers or sisters. I think he has the disposition for a large family. I want to learn more medicine. I want Haverson to keep teaching me on Tuesdays even when he thinks he is just visiting. I want you." "You have me," he said. "I want all of you," she clarified. "All the next 10 years and all the years after those. Those are mine to give," he said, "and I give them." She tilted her head back and kissed his jaw, which was stubbled and warm, and settled against him again, and the night held them quietly in its April warmth, and the town of Caldwell Wells went about its sleeping life around them, and the ridge was dark against the stars, and everything was exactly what it was. In the years that followed, what Delia had said on that porch came true in the way of things said by people who know themselves well enough to know what they are asking for. Alina Ruth Walden had her first proper riding lesson at 4.5 because she climbed onto a fence and onto a mare's back before anyone had agreed to teach her, and the mare, in her infinite patience, simply stood there and waited for someone to notice, and Benjamin, who had noticed immediately and watched for about 30 seconds to make sure she was secure, decided this counted as her starting the process herself, and that formalities could accommodate the timeline. Samuel grew into a young man of considerable seriousness and unexpected humor, who at 12 announced he intended to be a doctor or a horse trainer. And when Delia told him these were not mutually exclusive, he looked at her with the particular expression of a child receiving useful information and filed it away. Thomas Henry remained round and amiable and sociable, developing into the child most likely to have made friends with every person he encountered, and to remember all of their names and a relevant personal detail about each of them, which Delia found both charming and slightly alarming in its scope. Their fourth child, a girl born in the summer of 1891, they named Clara Josephine, for Clara Briggs, who had been in the room for 3 of the 4 births, and who received this honor with a display of emotion so magnificent that it required 3 handkerchiefs. Clara Josephine had her mother's red-brown hair and her own utterly distinct personality, which revealed itself by the time she was 18 months as a combination of focused curiosity and absolute stubbornness that suggested she was going to be, in the words of her godmother Frances Drummond, either a tremendous force for good or a very interesting problem, and possibly both. Caldwell Wells grew. The town that had been a frontier settlement in the late stages of becoming something else had become, by the early 1890s, a proper town, with a telegraph office and a newspaper, and a proper hotel with 3 stories and a restaurant and a school that had 2 teachers because one was no longer enough. The Walden livery remained what it had always been, essential and well-run, adapting as the town changed but maintaining the particular quality that Benjamin had put into it, the quality of a place where animals were treated with patience and skill and genuine care. And Delia's practice grew too, becoming in fact, if not in any official title, a central institution of the town's health, a place where people brought their children and their injuries and their worries, where the woman behind the desk knew what she was doing and did it without condescension, and where the going rate was always negotiable if you did not have much, a policy that she had established on the first day she opened and had never reconsidered. One afternoon in the spring of 1893, 15 years after she had arrived in Caldwell Wells on a stage with $43 and a bruise, Delia sat in the office of her practice between patients and found herself looking at the desk that had been Haverson's and was now hers, the careful organization of it, the labeled jars and the well-kept records and the dried wildflowers she kept in the window because they made the room nicer for patients, and she thought about all of it. Not nostalgically, not with the ache of something past, but with the clear-eyed satisfaction of a person surveying what they have made. She had made this. Everything in this room, everything in her life in this town, she had made by choosing to leave, choosing to stay, choosing to trust something that looked different from what she had known, choosing to open herself to it anyway, choosing every single day to live fully inside the life she had built. She heard Benjamin's voice in the yard outside, talking to someone. She could not hear the words, but she knew the quality of it, the unhurried tone. She would know his voice in any crowd, in any weather, at any distance. She sat at Haverson's desk, her desk in her practice, in her town, in her life, and she was at peace. That evening she walked home in the long golden light of the spring afternoon, through the main street of Caldwell Wells, past Mrs. Crane's dry goods store where Effie Crane waved from the window, past the school where she could see 2 children she recognized as Samuel's classmates, past the church with its red ribbon long replaced by other decorations for other seasons, and she turned in at the livery yard and found Benjamin there, just closing up for the day, turning the last of the horses out into the evening paddock, and he looked up when she came through the gate and smiled at her, the smile he had for her, the one that was not for anyone else. She crossed the yard and walked directly into his arms, which opened for her without hesitation and closed around her with the certainty of a man who has held the same person for 15 years and intends to continue indefinitely. She stood there in the warm evening with her face against his shoulder and the sounds of horses in the paddock and the smell of hay and cedar and the distant noise of children somewhere in the house. "Good day," he asked into her hair. "Very good," she said. "You?" "The Henderson boy brought in a new horse," he said. "Young animal, scared of everything. Reminded me of, well, a lot of work ahead, but good work." She lifted her face and looked at him. "You can fix anything that's worth fixing," she said. "Not anything," he said. "But the ones that are worth it, yes." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was her home, this quiet, certain man who had stood beside her in an alley and taken a nail from between his teeth to look at her honestly, and held her hand on a ridge in the August evening, and said "I do" in the voice he reserved for things that meant everything. This man who had been the kind she had not known existed. "I love you," she said, the same words as always in the same voice, and always meaning more than the words could carry. "I love you," he said, the same words, the same voice, and always enough. The children's voices came through the window of the house, Eleanor's carrying above the others with her characteristic volume, and a crash that was probably Thomas Henry, and then Samuel's low tone of adolescent authority attempting to restore order and not quite succeeding. The horses moved in the paddock in the last of the evening light. The ridge was red against the sky. Delia Walden stood in the yard she had known for 15 years, held by the man who had given her back the belief that what she deserved was something good, and she thought, this is the whole story. This is all of it. The window and the boot and the bruise and the stage at 4 in the morning, and the dry goods store and the limping roan and the lantern light in the stable and the ridge and the November rain and the dance and the vows and the children and the years. All of it. The running and the stopping. The fear and the slow, careful letting go of the fear. She had been running from one kind of man. She had run straight into another, the kind she had not known existed, the kind that stood beside you rather than over you, that asked what you wanted rather than telling you what you should want, that was steady in the deep way of someone who has no need to prove it. She had found him. She had built something with him. She had built something with herself, and the two buildings had grown together until they were the same structure, strong and warm and full of light, and full of the beautiful, complicated, ordinary, extraordinary noise of a life fully lived. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.